turn means power of the people, or rule of the people. So how have you made that link between democracy, focusing on man-made laws, and man having the power to legislate, be compatible with Sharia, where legislative and authority power is only one once?
I think that we've got to be careful, first of all, about when we use the word democracy. I agree with you. It's not necessarily the definition of the Western democracies that we're referring to. First of all, democracy within Islam, the kind of democracy that Muslims would formulate, perhaps, doesn't necessarily have to be that of a Western model or a Western paradigm. I think personally, first of all, it should be something that happens organically within Islam. Ijma' is one of the most useful starting points for this kind of a discussion, because it's something that you find within Islam. As I say, ijma' is not something that you need to justify on the basis of a text. Some jurists do this. They try to show the ijma', and I quoted the verse, in fact, that's used to show that ijma' is a principle. It's authoritative. But the very Quran itself is established through ijma'. What is ijma'? It's the community agreeing on something which is either good for it or bad for it, and legislation happening as a result. Okay? That legislation can take place through a body, an elected body, of a representation of that community, which will see to it that its decisions are made binding on the community. That's how ijma' would work early in Islam. It's also how, generally, the idea of democracy is understood. Now, I don't speak about specific types of democracy, but actually, there are even those democracies, even in the generally Western sense of the word democracy, there are those statutes which do not change, despite the consensus of the community. Lawmakers establish statutes, and they're not going to change. Okay? Or they will change with great difficulty over a very long time, over generations perhaps. So the same kind of thing exists within Islam. There are those things that in ijma' won't reverse. Those texts in the Quran which are explicit are not going to be changed. Now there'll be a debate on what are those texts in the Quran which are explicit. Which is the muhkam, which is the mutashabih, which is the ambiguous, which is the explicit. You will find that the idea of diversity exists there as well. To the point, in fact, where there's no single verse where there's a complete agreement of the community over history that it has either a single meaning or it's considered to be completely explicit or completely ambiguous. There's all sorts of discussion on that. But I hope that kind of begins to explain that it's not necessarily a specific model of democracy in a modern sense, but through understanding how ijma' works, you can see actually that it's quite a contemporary concept, and one that even a Western mind can be comfortable with. Yeah. I hope that, sorry, is that okay? Yeah.
I wanted to ask you something else, just a brother's question. I suppose a good summary of that might be just the well-banted about phrase proportional representation, but the back-end legislation is whatever, i.e. man-made or canon for religious law, and that's probably kind of it. Is that right? Is that what you were saying?
Can you say that one more time for me before I
I don't know what I just said. What I said was, in terms of the brother's comment about democracy and the Greek root meaning behind it and how does it fit in with Islam, I said a good summary of that would be the phrase proportional representation at the front end, regardless of what's at the back end. I.e., for Muslims it'd be Sharia, for the West it'd be statutory law, common law, and stuff like that. Is that a good summary?
I think that's a good summary.
Yeah, no, I was just checking my understanding.
Yes, I think
that's not even my comment. Sorry, I'm
glad for comments as well. That's a fair summary, I think.
First of all, absolute great, concise summary. And I know you kind of like whet appetite and just deliberately set it at a point where you're going to kind of elicit certain questions about seemingly kind of dodgy areas. It's fantastic. But just one thing I need clarification on, and I'm sure quite a few of those finish off on what you said, that the Quran is indisputable authority. However, it can have on one end of the spectrum a singular meaning each and every term, or it can have this kind of plurality. And that, you know, people are getting confused. And this brother here, Brother Omar, asked the question, oh, can the text ever be changed by this moving body of ijma? I just think you kind of explained that with the point about within the surah where you talk about the what's the word, minhaj, the method of translation.
Yeah.
I just think people could get confused in terms of you know, the ijma's ability to actually dilute what's in the canon. But that's not what you're saying, but it can just come across as being quite confusing. So I'd appreciate some comments on that.
You know, this kind of idea that there is no central authority which has a monopoly on interpretation in Islam is unsettling for some. I make this point because often what I'm asked is, well, how do Muslims then deal with extremism, for example, radicalization? If there is no single authority, how do you deal with groups who take positions of violent extremism? And it seems that you can't challenge those because there is this very difficult to claim absolute truth with all this kind of diversity and lack of central authority. What my point was is that that's a valid concern, but that in Islam, despite that central authority, it doesn't mean that correct readings or interpretations are not advocated. They are. A correct reading, in fact, that's something that every scholar will say. They've undertaken an ijtihad or an interpretation, an effort to understand the text and believe that their understanding is correct, but that there's acceptance that it may not be correct. Now, what I mean to say by the point that I made at the end is that it's not a problem to allow for, or rather there's no, perhaps it's probably going to be better for me just to repeat again, belief in the idea that the text can carry more than one meaning, that belief, which is what I'm proposing here or presenting, does not make me a moral relativist. Now, the idea that all readings are correct, they're all acceptable, that doesn't make me that moral relativist. Just like if someone were to embrace the idea that there's only one reading of the text, is of some kind of virtue, there's some great virtue in saying so. You've got to look a little more deeply at these two positions, in fact. And you'll see that there are still ways of working out what actually the correct reading is, and there being a support for that correct reading. That occurs. It occurs historically in Islam. And the development of schools of law, which eventually oust other schools, is an example of how, despite all of that diversity and openness for interpretation, you still start to see the crystallization of orthodoxy. But the key thing, and I think this is something, as unsettling as it sounds, I know it can sound unsettling, the power of ijma continues. Today, as far as the schools of law are considered, in mainstream Islam, there's the view that now that's it, that's the end of the schools of law. There's going to be no change now. They're fixed, established institutions. Ijma established them, and there's no change. That loses sight of the dynamism of ijma. Ijma is dynamic, and it continues with the existence of the community. The Quran comes to an end at the death of the Prophet ﷺ in terms of revelation. Ijma continues. It continues as long as the community survives. And that means that fine, there may come a time where the community decides now, this is where lies authority perhaps, or these are the institutions which we consider to be orthodox. But ijma, by its very nature, will always allow for the possibility of change, a reversal even back to the very early first century of Islam again, and for that whole process to start all over again. That's a possibility with ijma. Don't be surprised if in another 200 years a whole reversal has happened where the Quran again becomes the sole authority in the community, and a whole new process of interpretation begins, out of which is created new institutions of orthodoxy. And in fact, Islamists, or the Salafist movement within Islam, is seeking to do just that, to go back to the texts, go back to the Quran, and actually begin that process anew. It's been made possible because of the whole rupture that the Muslim world has experienced because of the colonial period and then post-independence. This openness now, secularized societies, has allowed actually for this renewed call to go back to the way of the first generation before that crystallization process started to happen, and it ends in about between the 9th and 11th centuries. So ijma is dynamic. It's unsettling because what does it mean? It implies the possibility that those things which have become established institutions and practices might change. But like it or lump it, that's there. That exists. Just to, it might be changed by people, an attempt to change the definition of ijma or to restrict its usage, but it exists. Yeah.
Sorry, I was with you up until the last few sentences. In the sense that post-colonialism, there might be this kind of, if there's a timeline, kind of leap back to the early kind of Salaf, and we're going to interpret it because there's a need for it, and we're not too sure about this crystallization period. Is that your opinion? Do you think that's more beneficial going forward, or are you still with the majority, with the ijma?
No, I'd be careful about going that far. Very careful about it. To say, for example, and this is important, to say that now there should be no recognition of centuries of intellectual output is dangerous, because then you create a chasm between the Quran and its revelation and ourselves here, which can make an understanding of the Quran almost impossible. Because it's through the ijma, in fact, that a lot of important information that we will use to understand the Quran has been preserved. So, not to necessarily jump to that point, but what I say is a reversal which doesn't at the same time ignore precedent and tradition, but which, as a result of which, creates new institutions, new legal institutions, and new other intellectual traditions that begin. And I think that's something very interesting and almost unique to Islam, and perhaps helps us to understand why today, in a secularizing world, Islam seems to have this funny knack for constantly reappearing. Or proving very difficult to nudge out of the way, both, especially in the public sphere. Because there's this constant renewal, going back to the Quran, or attempts at going back to it and starting the process again. Okay, so if tradition hasn't worked, or if it's the opinion that tradition hasn't worked, institutions have failed us, well, they acquired authoritative status because of ijma. They can be ignored. They can be ignored, especially where they don't have any real authority any longer. And actually, a lot of the institutions that I mentioned don't have the kind of authority, since they don't have the jurisdiction that they had before. So this is where the possibilities have opened up during the post-colonial period. So that's my own view. To be careful, but at the same time, these possibilities exist. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. Because we're getting quite a lot of questions on the paper, so in the interest of time, just ask one more question from the audience. Okay, so.
Okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit about secularism allowing the freedoms of people to reinterpret the Quran. But one of the problems with secularism is that it allows a corruption within, say, authorities to reinterpret the Quran. Now, we can argue that classical scholars like al-Rûmî and Imam Shafi, they had protection of the Islamic State, and they flourished.
I don't think that they had protection of the Islamic State. Abu Hanifa was tortured by the state for not taking a post if you read Ahkam al-Qudāt, which is an early text from the 2nd century of Islam, Ahkam al-Qudāt, al-Waqiyah, you'll find that Abu Hanifa is offered time and again a post. Qadi al-Qudāt, the judge of judges, was the position that he was being offered first, and when he refuses, he's approached by the Khalif himself, the Khalifa, and he said, I can demand this of you, that you accept this post, because Ati'u Allah wa Ati'u Rasul wa ulil amri minkum. The verse of the Quran says, obey God, obey His Messenger, and those in leadership over you. And Abu Hanifa says, according to the statement in Waqiyah's Ahkam al-Qudāt, he says, well, the heavens and the earth and everything in it were offered the amana, the trust, the covenant, to take the covenant, and everything rejected except for Bani Adam. And so if creation can reject the trust from God, then I can reject the trust that you are offering as a human being. And as a result of this, he's tortured, and this is well known. And he's not the only jurist who's tortured for not accepting the position of the state. So I'd be careful to say that the state protected the jurists. In fact, the state typically, not always, typically would manipulate or seek to manipulate and establish its own will through appropriating Islam. So, this is why I'd be careful to say, this is the utopian past, and today we're at some completely different point. When you start to probe history, you'll see that, in fact, it's not as clear as that.
Of course, I can't make a direct comment on that because I don't honestly know about it. But we can argue that whether the leader was just or not at the time, Abu Hanifa's work in accounting him on state issues and working as an intellectual to further Islam was positive regardless. And you can argue that whilst the Islamic State was implemented, he was at least trying to improve it, whereas secularism isn't the Islamic State. It's not.
Okay, a fair point. I don't think I'm advocating secularism.
No.
But I accept your point that,
A comment in regards to what the brother was saying. I think you're correct in some stances, but then going back to say that takes the power away from the individual Muslim, because living, no matter where you live, ijma is needed because the society is changing. Society continues to change, so we need to be able to adapt a book that was for all times and for all people, to suit all people. So if we're using a 9th century sort of idea in order to spread it across the world, it's not going to be uniform for everybody. Not everybody's going to accept it. Then you're going to have more people rejecting Islam than accepting it.
Thank you. Okay, so there are some questions on paper as well I've got to read out, so give everyone a fair chance. Is there a clear text in the Quran? Okay. It's a good thing about having things on paper. I suppose, is there a clear text in the Quran that states that a woman should cover her hair? I know that there is more emphasis on bosoms. Please explain this in terms of Sharia. I'm not a mufti. I'm not going to answer those sorts of questions.
We can see some chapters in the Quran.
Have a look at an interesting surah, Surah An-Nur.
And Surah Al-Ahzab as well. Surah Al-Ahzab.
Surah Al-Ahzab. Now, I say that I'm not a mufti, and I can't be a mufti. There are some clear imperatives in the Sharia, which I think are indisputable, and that is that a mufti cannot be the employee of an institution to which he may be subject to manipulation. Okay, and this is something that's key. And I mentioned Abu Hanifa's case, and I think that's exactly what he was acutely aware of. That the moment he becomes the employee of the state, then, well, if he continues as mufti, he's in a very precarious position. So and this is extremely important, it's extremely important to realise that a mufti, and I've mentioned this to my students in the last couple of weeks, a mufti who would be employed by the state, for example, of Egypt, and say that it's prohibited to take part in protests by the texts of the Quran. There's no mufti. There's no mufti at all, because there is that clear prohibition of not being paid for a fatwa or being involved with an institution. You have to be autonomous, independent, if you're going to speak as representative of God, of Allah, in issuing a fatwa or responding to a question. So, I mean, that's the case really. I'm not qualified to be mufti, but also I'm not in the position to be so.
Can you explain
Yeah.
mufti?
What's a mufti? Somebody who issues a religious legal verdict. I hope that is it? A simplified definition of the Sharia. It is difficult to present a simplified definition, in honesty, but one thing that the linguistic meaning of Sharia is useful to understand. This idea of a waterhole, the idea that it's a source of life. This is certainly how, I know it's not a precise definition, one that you perhaps would be familiar with in a typical science, but it sort of helps you to understand how Muslims have traditionally seen their law. They don't see it as barbaric, they don't see it as something that makes or renders life difficult and impossible. They actually see it as something that facilitates life, that allows for a betterment of society. How does it do that? Through this openness of interpretation, first of all. Through the Sharia itself validating possibilities and openness, methods of approaching the Quran and seeking to make it a text that can be lived, regardless of place, regardless of time. So that helps. I think that's the only one I gave in my talk, sort of the linguistic meaning, because I think that actually is, for something like religion, it's more useful to think about the way that the language is being used within the tradition, rather than trying to sort of etch out or hammer out a definition, which inevitably is going to fail because it'll exclude all sorts of things and that. But it's this broader kind of idea, which is the Sharia. So it's more than just law in the modern sense. It includes spirituality. It has a concern for the outward, the body, but also, maybe more importantly, the heart. Okay? So you have it does in fact have a concern for those both two important dimensions of human existence: the material, the body, and also the spiritual, the soul. Is that? Do we have time? Should I go through the question? Yeah. Okay. You said that Islam welcomes diversity, but what about the Hadith, in which the Prophet said that there will be 73 sects in the Ummah or in my community, and all will be in hell except one, and that one will be the one which follows the Quran and Sunnah. Surely the Aqidah issue is vital here, or have I got it all confused? Is there parentheses? Okay, so right, Islam welcomes diversity, but what about this hadith? There seems to be the statement of the Prophet. It's actually a well-known statement. It is recorded in traditions of hadith of there being 73 sects and only one being acceptable or orthodox. Now, I think it's good. I'm glad that you mentioned this. You brought up a hadith. Nobody has yet asked about hadith. I haven't said anything about hadith except for this prohibition of the Prophet to write down hadith. I make no mention of the Sunnah. I say that the two authoritative, infallible sources are the Quran and the Ijma'. Now, it's almost, I think it's not unknown to anybody that in Islam there are normally reckoned to be 4 sources of law: Quran, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas. This hadith, I think, does not, unless in some way you go to interpret this hadith in order to reconcile it with what I've presented, and that can be done, to suggest, say, for example, that one group is actually the majority, happens to be the majority, and the other sects are actually are going to be the minorities, the schisms. That's one way. But actually, more importantly, I would say that a hadith is not enough to counter the established authority of the Quran and the Ijma'. And that this hadith would not be sufficient, there's not enough of an evidence from the point of view of the Sharia to say that, well, then there can be no diversity. Because, first of all, I give clear mention of the initiative of the Prophet himself, first of all, to say that there is to be no one recording hadith except for the Quran here. Alright, so here is a clear statement that hadith per se is not to be considered an authority of infallible authoritative status on par with the Quran. And also I would go so far as to say the Ijma' as well. It's not to discount authority for hadith altogether, because of course hadith becomes, by especially the 3rd century of Islam, an extremely important source of knowledge and information about the Prophet himself. But there's a long, long period, there's a long process of 3 centuries before that actually happens and takes shape. The Ijma' is something that exists during the life of the Prophet himself and is already an established source of law. Well before the decision is taken for hadith to be considered both equal to the Sunnah and also an authoritative source of Sharia. This happens during, for those of you who want to look into this, you can read, you can find lots of sources on the role of Imam al-Shafi'i and his role in establishing an authoritative status for hadith. And you also, you can read up on the resistance to his view and to his project from the al-Rûmî, the jurists of the other schools, who continued to see things like the Quran and the Ijma' and freedom to interpret as being crucial to the development of Islam. So that's I hope that answers the question. I think there was one more question, but it looks very similar. Yeah.
Sorry, just because there could be things that are explicit or not in the hadith also, because you have qat' al-dalala and غير qat' al-dalala. So that could enter also, that we don't reject the hadith per se, but it could be that hadith can have different interpretations. Now, obviously the qat' al-dalala can have, qat' al-dalala means cutting proof. That means it's absolute proof. And it has to pass 2 tests, authenticity and that it's unambiguous. Now the question is, that should be also occur also in hadith. In which case, the problem is not with the hadith, the problem is with interpretation. Because if the hadith is open to different interpretation, more than one, then it becomes ambiguous. And then the problem becomes with the interpretation of that hadith, per se, not with the... So the ijma' and the Quran might not go against the hadith, but with interpretation of someone according to that hadith, because it's ambiguous.
That's a very interesting point, actually.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I agree with you, but I would disagree on this: that the problem is not with hadith. I don't want to be controversial here.
Yeah.
That's not my intention, and I recommend that you or everybody who's interested in this read up on it. But actually, I think that Imam al-Shafi'i, who I say was the key figure in establishing authority for hadith, in his al-Risala, which is his key text in jurisprudence, goes a long way to try to prove the validity of hadith, and that hadith is an authoritative states in a source of Sharia. And I think that there's a strong argument to say that the reason why he had to go to those lengths to argue for that is because there was strong resistance, not from hadith scholars, but from jurists, keen on allowing for, happy to use perhaps hadith or the sunnah in different forms, but keen to allow for an openness of interpretation, and fearful, just like the Prophet himself was fearful, I think, that if hadith becomes ultimately the source of the sunnah and nothing else, that there will begin to be a rigidity and a closing up of the possibilities of interpretation.
But what I would say is a bit more complex is that you have sometimes a verse that explains a verse, a hadith that explains a verse that explains a hadith. That it's actually, it molds into one more complex thing.
They do in fact.
Rather than
Quite often they used, you're right.
Even qiyas or qiyas analogy could come from Quran, Sunnah, then put together. So it's like more complex and just.
There is going to be difference of opinion though on what hadith is qat'iyyud dalala and dhanniyyud dalala. So which hadith? Excuse us for getting into
sorry about this.
Precise definitions, but what hadith is explicit and clear and unambiguous, and which isn't, that's subject to interpretation.
Then you would have a consensus on what is explicit then. Among the scholars, then you'd look where at least they agree on things, and that would be important, wouldn't it?
It'd be interesting to see where, at which points there are consensus on what's an explicit hadith.
Explicit hadith, which would be an
I mean, it's not unimaginable. But then if there is, I would argue that that consensus would be for that community, rather than for eternally for all communities. Because my view is that ijma' is binding and can be binding, but on that community rather than for all communities that follow.
I was arguing
that's against the
ijma' about this, but just this different points, just to precise them.
Sure, thank you. It's a good point.
My head that was far too technical. I'm an average man with no blogs around the street, and I think there's potential for confusion here, where you said traditionally, where they talk about the sources of law, you know, in terms of Quran, Sunnah, Ijma, Qiyas, and then you want to emphasise on two in particular, deliberately so. I know you're not trying to be controversial, but I think there needs to be some more emphasis in what it is that you say, in the sense that Ijma is not in isolation of the Sunnah or of the Hadith, you know, in terms of its own representation and the vehicle in which we see Islam. Yours is a very specific technical point in terms of the source of legal authority, that the Hadith will be used as a very kind of heightened authority, not compared to the Quran, but as, you know, as kind of the canon law. So it's not, you know, it's not ijma kind of floating around on the cloud until it's on the strong roots of Sunnah. You know, because it's potential for confusion. I'm a Joe Blogs, and I know Joe Blogs when I see him. There's quite a few of them there.
Can I differ with you and say, okay, apologies if there's some confusion, but I'm going to let people go ahead, and perhaps we can have a discussion afterwards. For those who are really confused, okay, we can have a discussion with it afterwards, because I fear that I'm. To go into any more explanation here, you know, in this place right now would get complicated, and I just don't think it's the place right now to discuss. But we can discuss this afterwards in the market. I'll be there. So, yeah.
Just a simple question. I mean, is there any links in history between English law, French law, and Sharia?
There are some studies, Western studies on Islamic law, which argue that Islamic law is actually just Roman law, represented, in some way reinvented, and that it almost excludes the influence of the Quran on the development of Islamic law. There's a lot to read you can read on this. So that's certainly something that there are Western studies on, trying to basically show the non-Islamic origins of the Sharia. Are you talking more in a contemporary context of
the last 200 years? You hear that, there's links between Maliki madhab and French law. I've heard of this, but I'm not sure of sources. I haven't read any books about it.
Brother,
I'm not familiar with this.
Brother, sorry to interject. Yesterday, talk of the Islamic Law, the online blog, he mentioned very specifically giving advice to a legal student, and he talks about the Maliki mother being linked to the common law of this country, and he actually mentions specific text by his Sheikh, which is an essay on that particular point. Yes. I've not looked at it, but that's what the blog says.
That's helpful.
Found tonight really interesting. What I want to say is that there's quite a few people I've met in the last few days who are sort of not from a Muslim background, that are interested to learn more, and it's sort of using this week as sort of stepping stone to try and learn more about Islam itself, and sort of more about sort of the customs and the origins of the faith. And it's quite relevant to the minute. You've heard with obviously David Cameron's from quite outrageous comments about sort of multiculturalism, and there's been issues about sort of Sharia law in the UK. What would you recommend to myself and the people that speak to as a sort of beginning and a way to sort of a beginner's guide to sort of Islam? How would you sort of say we should approach it? Because I don't study this at university, I do politics, I probably don't have enough time to sit down and read the Quran and sort of get into in massive detail. I
think the Quran is the starting point, to be honest.
Okay.
A serious study or a keen desire to understand Islam has to start there. So that's probably the best starting point. But also, you've got this, the ISoc. I think there's plenty of guidance on this that you can get. Perhaps after we disperse, you can talk to people. But I'd say that if you want a true representation and a serious sort of beginner's guide to it, you look at the Quran. You look at the Quran, because what I'm trying to argue here is that after the Quran, what you actually can end up doing is getting lost in a whole sea of interpretations and competing interpretations, not always, sometimes sort of mutually acknowledging each other or whatever, but this is the issue that you're confronted with in Islam. And that's because of that lack of central authority. So that's my suggestion to you as you start with the Quran. Okay. Any other questions? I think that should be probably run out of time. Thank you very much, all of you, and it'd be nice to see some of you in the marquee afterwards as well.
We would like to extend our sincere thanks to Mustapha Sheikh for his fascinating presentation. Tomorrow's topic is entitled Muslims, Christians and Jews, Sibling Rivalry, and will be delivered by the renowned scholar Abdul Hakim Murad, also known as Timothy Winters, from 5:30 p.m. in this lecture theatre. Please be on time so we can start early. We hope to see you there on campus throughout this week. For those with a bit more time, there will be an opportunity to have some food and further discussions in the marquee. Thank you all for attending.